Today I wish to celebrate the life and the work of Henry George, an economist who has made more sense to me than any other economist I've ever paid attention to. And he was, I think I might have been first put onto him when I was studying the law, and then later on I found out that he was also greatly admired by Aldous Huxley. And there are things about his approach which still leave me a little bit uncomfortable, because in terms of individualism or collectivism, I am certainly an individualist. I really don't believe that the collective should be able to force the individual to obey. And yet there are elements to what Henry George advocates which are very much collectivist. So his argument is that all wealth originates from the earth. Clearly, us human beings have the capacity through our labour to create wealth through our ideas. But ultimately, all wealth and productivity originates from the earth. How he would explain that is, for example, apples and food and the minerals that we use to make products all depend on having land to be able to extract those materials. If you are someone who, let's say, is an architect, you don't actually build things directly, you still need food, you still need somebody to be able to draw those materials from the land somewhere. So even those people who could be seen as living entirely in an abstract and intellectual domain depend on the riches of the land in order to sustain themselves, their families, and obviously the other people that they collaborate with. You know, a musician, for example, still needs materials for their instruments, they still need sustenance. And so his argument is that the poverty that we see in the world, and that particularly arises around cities, is as a result of the fact that there are people who do not have access to the land. They do not have access to shelter. They do not have the ability to grow their own food. And by depriving people the access to land, you are condemning them to poverty. And, it's possible to, he was making this point, way over 100 years ago. And to me, it seems like his as time goes on, what he was observing has been, the statements he was making about what he was observing have been fully justified. And nowadays, you've got people like Bill Gates who own, he's the largest farm owner in the United States. You've got these enormous wealthy oligarchs that are accumulating all of the land, and meanwhile people don't have a roof over their heads or the ability to grow their own foods. It's very likely that the supermarkets and the food system will collapse, and at that point people will have no recourse to create their own sustenance from anywhere. So I think it's very difficult to argue the fact that if people are displaced from the land, they no longer have the ability to feed and create shelter for themselves. So his solution to that was that, he wasn't someone who was an advocate of the state, and he really didn't like taxation. And he was an advocate for a world where we had no taxation, that when you earn money, that's your money. The state shouldn't be able to come and claim it from you. But he also recognised that there were things that were best produced by the state because they were in the common good. They were good for everybody. Things like roads, power systems, water systems. So his idea was that ultimately all land should be owned by the state, and that everybody pays a market rate as a rent to the state that would then use that money to provide all of the common goods that country could benefit from. So no longer would anybody be able to gain an income from property. And as someone who has been condemned to renting property his whole life, and sometimes feeling extremely hard done by landlords that were clearly profiteering, as a tenant there was so little choice, so little freedom, so little power. There was a time when I was a young boy when people had such a thing as a lifetime tenancy. That does not, you can't even stay in a place for 6 months sometimes. So nowadays we are, as tenants, people without land, without property, we are absolutely at the mercy of the marketplace, and there's generally very little grace or mercy. So this would undoubtedly create a more egalitarian society, because no longer would people be able to live off the income of multiple properties. You would have the property that you live in, and that's it. And for the property that you would have, you would pay a rent to the state that would then be used to provide education, electricity, roads, and all of this. Now, I haven't yet been made aware of any flaws in this idea that I've been able to really pick apart. It just beggars belief to me that we're not, maybe it's still yet to come. Maybe he was ahead of his time. One of the things that people obviously are concerned about is, okay, I've got my home or I've got my multiple properties. Who's going to compensate me for having to give them all up to the state or having to hand them over? Well, people would still be so that's right. What it was about paying ground rent, so that you can ultimately have whatever building you have on the rent that you're on the piece of land that you're paying rent for to the state, but the building remains yours. So you can then rent out that building to someone, but ultimately the rent is going to the state for the land that it's on. Basically it's a way of creating this shift back to a more egalitarian society without immediately going in and saying, right, we're taking all your property. It doesn't work like that. I don't know if I'm really in this 10-minute segment able to get across the fine details of this, but he goes into this idea in some length of how, why is it that the rich would sign up for this? And the point is that nobody benefits from an unequal society, and we are seeing levels of inequality right now that are off the charts like we've never seen before. And that doesn't ultimately serve anyone, because it comes to a point when the poor have had enough and the rich are not numerous enough and cannot build high enough walls around their properties, that they end up suffering a very miserable death. People cannot tolerate inequality for extended periods of time. It was the seedbed to almost all of the revolutions, that you had a very rich and wealthy upper class and very impoverished lower classes that finally have enough and say, right, you're out, mate, with your head on a pike very often. So Henry George, I feel, is someone who's really worth checking out if you're not aware of him. His book is very simple to read. You can find PDFs of it everywhere. What's it called? I can't remember the title. Of Poverty or something. It's very easy to read. It's very convincing. I suppose a lot of economists sound convincing when we first hear their ideas. And maybe I've been hoodwinked. Maybe someone can educate me in the comments. But I certainly, for one, feel that he has the most persuasive arguments that I've encountered with regards how to create a little bit of justice in this world where people need to be able to be valued, to have property. Private property is definitely linked to freedom. If the state takes charge of all property, then we're in big trouble. And we've seen that over and over again in the last 100 years. So it's how can you find a balance where there is a state, there's a recognition of a state, but where its power and its capacity to interfere in people's private lives is strictly limited. You know, one of the fascinating things about this is the market determining of prices for rent and for property, which would carry on under Henry George's proposed system. So yeah, this recording this makes me want to reread that book and to reacquaint myself with his theories and his propositions. But I'm going to take a moment to give thanks to probably the only economist in this list of 365 festivals. A moment to give thanks for Henry George.